You weren't supposed to keep people waiting at the gate. That's what the young sergeant muttered as he tapped his watch, looking over the woman in the plain black hoodie like she was a late pizza delivery. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, just adjusted the strap on her duffel and stood quietly, as if time moved differently for her. If you agree that respect should be given before you see the uniform, like and subscribe, because moments like this prove why it matters. That morning was cold, the kind of wind that cut through the airfield fence and stung your skin, but it wasn't the temperature that made the two guards at Checkpoint Charlie bristle. It was her calm. The first guard, a corporal with a fresh high and tight, squinted at the faded civilian ID she'd handed over like it was a joke. "Ma'am, this expired years ago. You can't just walk in here and expect clearance because you've been on base before." She gave a small shrug, the kind you make when the conversation's already beneath you. "I'm expected at the main briefing hall," she said evenly. "If you call operations, they'll confirm." But they didn't call. They smirked. The corporal passed the ID to his partner, a private who looked barely old enough to shave, who chuckled under his breath and said, "We get 3 or 4 of these a week. Folks who think they're somebody because they've been near a runway once." She didn't flinch. If anything, she looked almost bored, her gaze drifting past them to the hangars in the distance, like she already knew she'd be inside soon enough. A couple of airmen wandered past, glancing at the scene, but no one intervened. The corporal leaned against the booth and said, "Tell you what, why don't you wait outside the fence until we get time to run this, which might take a while." He thought that was funny. She just adjusted her duffel again, her voice calm, but with an edge now. "You're making a mistake." The private smirked. "We'll take our chances." And that's when the communications officer in the booth, a staff sergeant with more years than the two of them combined, tilted his head. He'd been half listening, but the name she'd given, Marquez, landed somewhere deep in his memory, like a radio signal crackling to life after years of static. He glanced through the smudged glass at her, took in the way she stood, not fidgeting, not pleading, not shifting her weight like most civilians did when the gate guards got sharp. She looked like someone used to waiting under worse conditions. Without a word, he snapped a quick photo of her ID, sent it through a secure channel, and kept his eyes down as the two guards kept chuckling. Outside, the wind caught the edge of her hair, pushing it back from her face, and for the first time, the private saw something in her eyes that made him glance away. Not anger, not even annoyance, but patience. The kind that only comes from knowing you're not the one who should be nervous. Inside the booth, the comms sergeant's computer gave a sharp ping. A priority reply came back faster than he'd expected. Confirmed. Escort Brigadier General Elena Marquez, to briefing immediately. He read it twice. Then the base radio lit up, the kind of all-call that made everyone within earshot straighten involuntarily. "All posts. This is command. Locate and escort Brigadier General Elena Marquez to the main briefing hall immediately. I repeat, escort the general." Now, the corporal's mouth actually dropped open. The private's face went pale. They both turned slowly toward the woman they'd been treating like a pushy visitor, and she was just standing there, one eyebrow raised as if to ask, "Well?" The moment hung in the air for a beat, the kind of silence that feels heavier than shouting. And then, in a blur of tires on tarmac, a black SUV came around the corner and braked hard by the gate. Two senior officers stepped out, saluted her sharply, and one said, "Ma'am, your escort is ready." She nodded once, stepping past the frozen guards without a glance. The officers fell in on either side of her, and the SUV door closed with the solid, final sound of a world shifting into place. The corporal and private stood at rigid attention now, eyes locked forward, the echo of that radio call still ringing in their ears. The comms sergeant didn't say a word. He didn't need to. In the distance, the SUV rolled toward the main compound, and base personnel, catching sight of the passenger, began saluting as it passed. The whispers started almost instantly, moving faster than the vehicle itself. The missions in West Africa, the hostage extractions in mountains no map would admit existed, the humanitarian airlifts after the typhoon, stories no one outside certain rooms was supposed to know. But for those who did, the name Marquez wasn't just another name. It was the blueprint for getting impossible things done. Back at the gate, the corporal shifted his weight, swallowing hard. The private kept staring straight ahead, trying to remember if he'd said anything too stupid. then realizing it didn't matter. She'd remember. People like her always did. And somewhere deep in the hangars, the morning's briefing was about to start, with a chair at the head of the table reserved for the woman they'd almost left standing in the cold. The SUV rolled through the compound like a current, pulling everything into its wake, the black paint reflecting slivers of hangar lights and the muted gray of the overcast sky. And inside, Brigadier General Elena Marquez sat in silence, her gaze fixed ahead, as if the chaos of the last 10 minutes at the gate hadn't existed at all. Outside, the radio call still ricocheted through the base. Escort General to briefing now. And with every repetition, postures straightened, conversations died mid-sentence, and eyes followed the vehicle with a mixture of shock and shame. At the gate, the young corporal and private hadn't moved from their rigid positions, their ears still hot with the realization that they had dismissed one of the highest-ranking officers in the region, and the comms sergeant, who had been the only one to listen, watched them quietly, knowing they'd replay that moment in their minds for years. As the SUV approached the main administration building, the first ripples of recognition became a visible tide. Officers leaving offices, airmen pausing in formation, a mechanic stepping out from under an aircraft wing, all coming to attention as the vehicle passed, some saluting before they even knew why, others recognizing her face from briefing slides and unit histories whispered over late-night coffee. When the SUV stopped, two colonels were waiting, each snapping to attention before opening her door, and one, without meeting her eyes, said, "Ma'am, the room is prepped for you." She stepped out, her boots striking the pavement with the unhurried precision of someone who didn't need to prove she belonged there, and the murmur of watching personnel dropped into the kind of silence that only arrives when the unspoken truth is finally understood. This was the woman who had planned the coastal evacuation that saved thousands when a storm overtook an entire fleet. The officer who had walked into hostile negotiations unarmed and walked out with 30 prisoners of war alive. The strategist whose contingency plans were now standard operating procedure across two allied militaries. She gave no speech, offered no reprimand for the reception she'd received at the gate. Only a curt nod to the assembled honor guard before disappearing inside the briefing hall. Behind her, the colonels closed the doors, sealing out the whispers, but not the lesson that had already settled into the bones of the base. The uniform doesn't make the leader, and you don't need to see the stripes to know when you're in the presence of one. Inside the main briefing hall, the atmosphere was sharp enough to cut through. Screens glowed softly in the dimmed light. Folders sat neatly aligned in front of each seat, and a row of senior officers murmured in low voices until the door opened and Brigadier General Elena Marquez stepped in. Not hurried, not hesitant, just with the kind of steady presence that made every chair shift subtly toward her without anyone realizing they'd moved. No one introduced her, no roll call was taken. Those who didn't know her by face recognized her by the way conversation died the instant her boots touched the floor. She set a slim leather folder on the table, slid into the empty seat at the head, and with a calmness that didn't need volume, said, "We have 72 hours to prevent an incident that will change this region for a decade." Her tone stripped of preamble. Maps flickered to life on the screens, satellite overlays, infrared night shots of coastal approaches, tight clusters of red and yellow markers threading across terrain that most of the room had only ever seen on a briefing slide. She began moving through the plan with surgical precision, recalculating supply routes on the fly, revising troop movements to shave hours, sometimes minutes, off critical deployment times. Mid-sentence she would glance at an officer, call them by name without checking a roster, and give them an exact task with coordinates that she didn't once need to reference on paper. Her voice never rose. But the pace of her orders pulled everyone into the gravity of the moment until even the most skeptical colonels found themselves scribbling notes like cadets at their first command lecture. 45 minutes later, the meeting ended as abruptly as it began. No closing remarks, no motivational speech. Just this simple, final directive. You know your parts. Execute them. Chairs scraped back, officers saluted, and she walked out, leaving in her wake that strange kind of silence that's half relief, half awe, when people realize they've been given exactly what they needed by someone who knew it all along. Outside, the SUV waited, its engine idling in the cool air, But instead of climbing in, she turned away, her steps carrying her down the long stretch toward the front gate. The colonels at her side hesitated but said nothing. They understood this wasn't part of the schedule. This was part of the point. The walk was slow, deliberate. Airmen in coveralls paused mid-task to salute. A group of junior officers snapped to attention without being told, and mechanics peered from under the wings of grounded aircraft to watch her pass. When she reached the gate, the young corporal and private were still at their post, their backs stiff, their eyes locked forward, the tension in their posture not from regulation but from the weight of what they now knew. She stopped directly in front of them. The corporal's Adam's apple bobbed once. The private's grip on his rifle strap tightened. For a moment she said nothing, letting the sound of the wind against the fence fill the space, letting them feel every second of the distance between the way they'd spoken to her hours earlier and the truth they now understood. Then, without warning, she came to attention and gave them a salute. Crisp, perfect, impossible to misread. It wasn't mockery, it wasn't absolution, it was a statement. I acknowledge you. Now acknowledge better. The corporal's hand twitched before snapping up in return. The private followed a beat later, his jaw clenched, his eyes steady. Do better, she said simply, her voice level, her gaze moving between them. The uniform doesn't make the leader. You don't have to see the stripes to give respect. With that, she turned and walked back toward the SUV, the sound of her boots against the pavement echoing long after she'd climbed inside. The vehicle rolled away, but the gate didn't feel the same anymore. In the days that followed, stories about her swept through the base. Not the official biography in the personnel file, but the whispered accounts from those who had been there. The officer who'd orchestrated the coastal evacuation that saved thousands when the storm hit without warning. The one who'd walked into hostile negotiations without armor and walked out with 30 POWs alive. The strategist whose contingency plans had been quietly adopted by 2 allied militaries. The corporal at the gate stopped making quick jokes at visitors' expense. The private started greeting every person, civilian, enlisted, officer, the same way. With respect first, questions second. And months later, when new recruits arrived, the tale was retold over mess hall tables and late-night guard shifts. Not as a cautionary tale about checking IDs, but as a reminder burned into the culture of the post. Rank isn't always visible, but character is, and you never know which is standing in front of you until it's too late to take your words back.